Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today we are joined by Agrii's David Leaper, Seed Technical Specialist, and Sarah Hawthorne, Head of Arable Products for DSV here in the UK. With the area of oilseed rape being grown down this year, crops currently in the ground are looking very good. Today we're going to re-examine how to get the best out of this crop. What are the latest seed breeding developments and agronomy views? This episode qualifies for basis and Naroso points. So, good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you very much indeed for making the time to come along. And Sarah, I know you've been on your travels, and David, I know that you're very busy. Can we start off with just setting the scene, really? And David, maybe I can ask you first. How is the area down to orchard rape looking this year?
Well, the area is actually looking surprisingly good, and it's one of, after a period of 3 months of drought, oilseed rape seems to be one of the few crops that's coped with this spring. And I think many farmers are very optimistic in terms of the yields from oilseed rape this year. And that's great because we've had a number of years now where, the interest in the oilseed rape crop has waned because of some of the issues. So it's a really nice position to be in.
And Sarah, what are your thoughts?
I think we've definitely seen lower flea beetle numbers than in previous years. I think the sunshine at flowering has been really important. We often see much higher yields after sunshine at flowering, and actually the dry weather can be beneficial to oilseed rape. It has a really big rooting system, and also with rain on the forecast, it could be the perfect storm for some nice high yields this year. I've seen some of the best crops I've seen in years. But I think also the concern is that obviously with oilseed rape, we saw a lot more bumblebees around the place. And I've definitely noticed less bees around. My lavender hasn't even pollinated this year, and just no bees about. I do think that having more oilseed rape in the rotation is really beneficial to bees.
And David, thinking about how good the crop has looked in recent weeks, how does that make growers and agronomists feel about the crop?
Yeah, I think that there's been a lot of relief, to be fair, given the challenges we've had in the past. The drop in the acreage, if we look back, has been driven by, more recently, flea beetle. But I think the cards were on the table some years ago with ever increasing blackgrass on farm. And as an August drilled crop with relatively few graminicide options, that certainly wasn't helping. So we've seen a steady reduction in the acreage. In fact, it's dropped back from 750,000 hectares 15 years ago to what is now about 220,000. So it's been a significant drop back.
And can we explore some of those reasons why growers are concerned with growing this crop? And one of those that I've been hearing is that cost of, or rather investment in the crop.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's lots of different elements. Obviously, the seed is quite expensive. You've got that risks early on, and then you've obviously got herbicides and then fungicides. But obviously, we've moved forward with a lot of the FOMA now. And historically, we used to use things like more clear fields, but now we've got adding SFIs in with different companions. You've obviously got those added costs as well. But yeah, no, it's definitely a front-loaded crop, which does add an element of risk. But, there are ways that you can manipulate the crop, so you spend a little bit later now with some of these better performing hybrids.
Thanks, Sarah. And we'll come back to seed breeding advancements in a little while. But to begin with, you both mentioned pests. What are the current pest levels, bearing in mind that the area grown is less than last year? What are your thoughts?
So it's really difficult to say because we've obviously had 2 very harsh winters which have effect on insects, but also that widening of the rotation is definitely helping. Generally, historically, we'd see, some farmers growing wheat rape, Many of them a 3-year rotation, but we're seeing a much wider rotation now, up to 6 years. So we're definitely seeing a much widening, and we can only hope that this is helping reduce flea beetle numbers. Also, lots of farmers are doing so many brilliant things to help reduce the numbers of flea beetle. And I think some of these things are definitely working as well.
Yeah, David, any thoughts that you'd like to add?
Well, I think we need to remind ourselves that oilseed rape's a relatively modern crop, and it was introduced back in the 70s as a break crop that was at the time really cheap and relatively easy to grow, and was perfect as a great entry for wheat. Now, in the early 2000s, it was so profitable. It became so widely grown, often in those short rotations, that we've caused a problem for ourselves. And, the main problem has been pests, which have built up. So we've been through, let's hope, the worst, where we've seen literally impossible to establish oilseed rape in some areas of the UK. But it was certainly noticeable at harvest last year. There were fewer adults, certainly coming out of the grain store. There were fewer adults about, and the numbers have dropped. And that is partly attributed to the more extensification and wider rotations that farmers are now using.
Can you remind us as to the value of growing oilseed rape in the rotation? Why should a grower consider growing this crop again?
In the UK, we've got relatively few arable crops that we can grow profitably. The key crop for the UK is clearly wheat, and barley sits alongside that. And then when we're looking for true break crops to break the cycle of cereals, oilseed rape is the perfect crop because, firstly, it is drilled and harvested at a different time to cereals. So in terms of managing workloads, it's been ideal. In terms of the sort of weeds that build up, you have a broadleaf crop, so you're able to use different herbicides to control those weeds, and also nutritionally it helps. But of course, environmentally it has its benefits, and certainly when we were looking back at the neonic withdrawal, it was widely seen that oilseed rape was probably one of the more diverse crops in terms of biodiversity. So it has value not just agronomically and culturally in the farm rotation, but it does bring more things to farming generally.
Yeah, and Sarah, you mentioned that comment about bees, didn't you?
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree with everything that David says. I think it does really make an excellent break crop. When we speak to Tim Lammyman, who's got the world record wheat crops, he always says that he always puts an oilseed rape before his winter wheat, because he always sees that really big improvement in yield afterwards. And we often see that on farm as well. And I think what David was saying about managing the workflow on farms, because we're growing more wheat in the rotation, putting much more pressure on that October drilling. And the last 2 years, we've seen so much rain in October. It's made drilling really difficult. People then looking at trying to drill in the spring when we're getting lots and lots of that the weather can change quite drastically then, and the yields can be dropped. That oilseed rape gave farmers that early entry at harvest, and then that element of drilling that could break down their whole drilling cycle really, and it really helped reduce the workload.
We also need to bear in mind the commodity price. I think we've seen the last 20 years strong demand for vegetable oils, particularly healthy vegetable oils, and oilseed rape fits that bill. Certainly the price of oil is generally linked to mineral oil prices. We've got the biofuels inclusions, which have helped stabilize oil prices, and there's global demand, and it's always been strong. So I think against the backdrop of cereals, and certainly the local cereal market, oilseed rape has always continued to deliver in terms of profitability. It does go down sometimes, but the outlook long term is that we need these healthy oils.
And Sarah, I know that you have just returned from your tour of trials and research sites in Europe. Where did you go?
Just Germany. We went to the breeding station, which is absolutely fabulous. If you ever got an opportunity to go, it's amazing what they do over there. It really is fascinating.
And on your travels there, how were the oilseed rape crops looking?
Their crops look, fabulous as well. They're seeing more flea beetle than previous years, which is always a benefit for us, because when they see more flea beetle, obviously more investment is put into the crop. Like at DSV, we invest, heavily in flea beetle projects, so the AHTB, John Innes Centre, Terra Nova, but because there's been less demand in Germany, probably less of a priority, but now going forward, I think it'll be much more of a priority going forward, definitely.
And Sarah, you talked there about the amazing work that you're doing at your research site in Germany. David, what is the importance of genetics and varietal choice when it comes to growing oilseed rape, and what are the trends too?
As I mentioned, oilseed rape is a relatively young crop and has benefited enormously from the amount of investment that the plant breeders have put into the development of the crop. 25 years ago, we had varieties which were good, but they had issues in terms of disease susceptibility. They tended to be weak stemmed. But we've learned a lot in terms of how to grow them. But most importantly, we've seen a massive development in terms of the breeding effort. The fact that we've got royalties in the UK has always been great for plant breeders, but in many parts of Europe it hasn't. So the development of hybrids, oilseed rape, has actually been allowed the breeders to intensify their breeding efforts because they've got more income coming in, and that has been reflected in a massive improvement in the oilseed rape crop through disease resistance, through more yield stability, through higher oil contents, a whole host of things. So the oilseed rape crop arguably is better than it has ever been.
And Sarah, as plant breeders at DSV, what has been your focus? What is your focus right now?
So historically, we focused on conventional and hybrid breeding. We now look at 100% hybrid breeding because we can get the traits that we require much quicker that way. So the hybrid is a cross-pollination of two varieties and combining that genetic material, to produce unique traits in the offspring. So hybrids could have higher yields, better drought tolerance, more resilience, hybrid vigor. And we also use, I think we're one of the very few breeders that actually use the Agrii system and the MSL system. And they both work in similar ways to give that F1 hybrid, but it just gives us a bit more flexibility than other breeders.
And so, David, which varieties are you looking at in Agrii trials, particularly with a view to the future?
Well, I think when we look at hybrids, there are a number. There's the sort of conventional hybrids, if you like, where we're looking at some of the, or many of those traits to deliver high yields and high oil contents and provide resilience in terms of growing them. We've also got the Clearfield, which was originally of great interest because of the prevalence of brassica weeds on the farm. And as we had those very intensive rotations, they were used to control those very difficult weeds. Of course, we have clubroot, as Sarah has mentioned, tends to be in certain areas, particularly in the north, where it's really impossible to grow a normal variety where you need the clubroot tolerance. And then we've got the added value varieties looking for premiums from the oil sector. So historically, we've always had higher rusics, which are going into more industrial oils. But then 20 or so years ago, we saw the introduction of higher leics. So the portfolio of most seed companies will cover those varieties, but the largest proportion is the hybrids, which is growing simply for yield.
Your guide to the best winter oilseed rape varieties has just landed. Visit yearbook.agrii.co.uk. View the latest National Seed Yearbook now. Sarah, I'm a grower. I'm listening to both of you talking here about the amount of work you're putting into the genetics and breeding these varieties. Should I have more confidence to maybe give oilseed rape more of a go on my farm?
I think my advice would be, go back to basics, grow it on a smaller scale, grow it close to where, potentially where you live, so you can keep an eye on it. Because actually this year, more pigeons than flea beetle were about. Do you know what I mean? Because it's a smaller area, and just keeping, in control of those. And just managing. I think there's a real potential to get back into oilseed rape, and I think people just need the confidence. Choose a high vigor variety. Don't look for a variety that has high vigor in the autumn and in the spring. That's really important. Also, some of the varieties that flower a little bit earlier can be a benefit because they can get away a little bit quicker from the larvae in the spring. Definitely look at the hybrid section. Ring the breeders, ask them for their best picks. We're an open door. You're really looking for varieties with compensation abilities to grow back from leaf damage, weed damage, and we know those varieties. So don't be afraid to come and see us at cereals, come to our open days, go and come to Agrii's open days. David's brilliant on different variety choices. Also, the silent killer that we all forget about, Verticillium wilt. Really important to look at varieties with Verticillium wilt, especially if you've had a lot of oilseed rape in your rotation in the past, because it is rife. But we have some varieties with some brilliant resistances mechanisms with them now, and some really stay green genetics. So definitely look at those as well.
Great points there, Sarah. And David, one of those big reasons as to of hesitancy with being involved in this crop is, of course, cabbage stem flea beetle, isn't it?
Of course.
Talk a little bit about your project Reboot, and maybe that could be interesting for us all to hear about.
Yes, the risks of establishment are high, and indeed, flea beetle will have an effect in the spring as well. So it has become a major issue and a major blocker for the crop. So much so that the industry has come together under this initiative called Oilseed Rape Reboot. And their aim is to compile the expert view, if you like, to look at the top 10 strategies for managing and mitigating against flea beetle damage. And this pulls in together commercial companies, the breeders, and research and experts in all aspects of growing oilseed rape. And I think it's basically putting collective thoughts together on the table that growers can then use. So we've been involved, and one of the areas that we've looked at is trying to establish what the levels are in the crop out there this spring. We've contributed a number of samples along with Hutchinson's and United Oilseeds to get a nationwide view on larval numbers in the crops. And it has been quite interesting because of the samples that we collected, over 50 crops that we checked out, only 3 crops were free of larvae. And typically we were getting 3 larvae per plant, up to about a dozen or so in the hotspots of Cambridgeshire. So these are relatively low by historic standards. But I think the one thing it has flagged up is that the pest is out there, it's widespread, it's in our crops, albeit at low levels. And this is probably because we have adopted an approach of drilling earlier. And what you do by drilling earlier is that you may establish the crop better because you've got the crop established before the adults have an ability to eat it. But it means you get more larvae. So we are not in a position where we have broken the cycle of the pest, but we've got it to a level that hopefully with the agronomic expertise, the cultural practices combined with the best varieties, we can continue to grow oilseed rape well.
And Sarah, I can see you nodding your head there in agreement. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, I think David's come up with some really good points. We've spent a lot of time looking at flea beetle and what we can do to mitigate the problems with it. We've done a lot of companion crop trials, and we use a Lafargo, a buckwheat, which we use with Agrii, and we're seeing some really amazing effects of that variety. Sort of has the effect of sort of shadowing the oilseed rape, and also the ability of, it's like a phosphorus pump as well. But I guess there's lots of different schools of thoughts on drilling day. I agree with David. We have gone down the early drilling route because we see these big flushy crops, and that's what everyone wants to see. But I think it's so important to, look at moisture at drilling. You farmers know what you're doing. The big thing is moisture. If you've got moisture, that plant can get away and grow as fast as possible. It's really important. So the old school of thinking was to keep the volunteers, sort of the trap crop. But I think we've sort of now think that actually that can have a negative effect on the population, potentially increase that. So we're now saying as soon as oilseed rape is harvested, we need to disturb the soil. We can use straw rakes or things like that as soon as possible to just break that sort of cycle up as well. But I think if we're going into that September drilling, which I think is a really good idea if we've got moisture and we've still got temperatures, because those temperatures can drop quite down significantly. Potentially we need to look at higher seed rates. Instead of the 45 to 50, we may be looking at the 60s or 70s, because we're probably going into lower daylight degrees, colder temperatures, and sort of everything is against us when we drill in September. So DSV are launching a new product. It's not actually available yet. It's a combination of two different oilseed rape varieties that we grow at the moment, which is going to allow us to drill this new type of variety at the end of September, start of October, and then it will give us a 3-week earlier harvest. So potentially we could miss that flea beetle migration, but these varieties would need less days in the calendar year to grow, but obviously they are slightly behind in yield and they don't have all the traits we need at the moment. But it is something that we are working on, and we think, potentially there's lots of hurdles that we need to get through, because obviously AHDB list and the national listing system aren't set up for these different types of oilseed rape varieties. But they're something that we're invested in to try and get these out onto farm within the next 3 to 5 years.
And David, from your experience in the field, any top tips that we can learn from you in terms of selecting the right varieties with regards to cabbage stem flea beetle?
Oilseed rapes traditionally drilled in the last week in August. And we have, we've known for some time that the best way to get away from cabbage stem flea beetle altogether is drilling later. However, the adults migrate through the first half of September. So really you have to be drilling late in September, and anybody growing oilseed rape knows that if the weather changes, for example, last autumn, where we have a lot of rainfall, soil temperatures decline, and it becomes a very risky proposition. Some farmers are being successful with it, and especially some down in Dorset are looking at a later drilling slot, but it's not appropriate for anywhere. If we could get away from flea beetle altogether, but the majority of farmers are going to be drilling in early August. So again, we have to effectively live with it.
Can you share a little bit about, what areas are at risk from flea beetle?
Risk of flea beetle first reared its head in the sort of Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire area, and it really didn't feature elsewhere, but it effectively stopped oilseed rape production in large swathes of East Anglia and has moved further east and south and west, and effectively has become a national problem. It's always been a bit of an issue in North Yorkshire, particularly on the Wolds. But as you go further north, it has always been less of a problem, and certainly up into Scotland is really not a problem at all. So some of the best crops have been in the north over the last few years. Now, of course, in the north, crops have a different microclimate. They tend to be more exposed to light leaf spot. And of course, on some of the more acidic soils in the far north, we have the issue of clubroot. So in Scotland, clubroot has always been an issue. We can't completely control it. There's a degree of tolerance. We've seen some really good varieties recently with the introduction of Crusoe and DSV's Computer, which have come into the market, which have built in, as we've seen with other hybrids, they've been stacking these traits. So they're benefiting from turnip yellow's virus resistance. Of course, we've got the Mendel gene in those, and much better disease resilience all around.
And can you both share your knowledge of the various schemes that are out there to help alleviate some of that risk the farmers are taking putting this crop in the ground?
Probably half of the UK hybrid area is supported by one risk share in one form or another. Now, this is where either all or part of the money is paid back to the farmer for the seed if the crop fails to establish by the end of October. So this is positive because it gives a financial de-risking, if you like, particularly on seed.
And Sarah, are DSV involved in such schemes as a seed breeder?
Yes, yeah. So we've got several varieties on risk share schemes. We've also got sailor returns. So if the seed goes out on farm and it's too dry, we will take the seed back. We have lots of different schemes for different companies, and yeah, we're heavily involved in that.
And David, in terms of helping farmers where they're trying to mitigate the risk of flea beetle, you call it reserve seed. What is that?
Reserve seed was something that we introduced a few years ago because we recognised, with flea beetle being an issue driving earlier drilling, farmers wanted to get their crops in the ground before the 15th of August in many instances. So this is overyeared as black seed. It's tested, it's treated and shipped out in the year of use. But having that seed is really important and is increasingly important, particularly with flea beetle.
Great. So with all that said, what's the outlook for this autumn in terms of oilseed rape area? Sarah, what are your feelings? What do you think?
Well, I said the other day 320, and someone looked very shocked at me. But any growth, I think there's got to be growth. I think the positive momentum is there. Crops look great. The price looks great. There's lots of establishment schemes available to de-risk the crop. I think people will give it a go again, just because there's so many fabulous looking crops out there.
And with this season's crops looking so good, Sarah, what would be your advice to growers listening today that can help make it a real success looking ahead to the next season?
I'd be looking at varieties which have a de-risk establishment scheme. I'd be drilling more on moisture availability than calendar date. I'd be looking for varieties which have regrowth on leaves and high compensating ability. I'll be, like David, looking at high vigor and high spring vigor, earlier flowering dates, and also maybe a variety with a new FOMA resistance, just to take that pressure off that high upfront spend.
And David, what advice would you like to offer up for those listening today?
My recommendations for this autumn are to select the right fields, plan to put rape in, assess the conditions on the day in terms of crop and available moisture, and use the best practice that has been recommended through a number of years' experience, and that will be put together in the Oilseed Rape Boot recommendations. And most importantly, select a variety that has good, consistent performance, good autumn vigor, and this rapid spring regrowth.
Thank you, David and Sarah, for guiding us in rethinking oilseed rape. Do stay tuned here on Tramlines with some great episodes ahead, featuring the latest news, unlocking spring barley, and come with us as we attend Groundswell to hear the current thoughts on regenerative farming. If you have any questions for our experts that you would like answered, email them in to info@agrii.co.uk. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. See you next time.